webinar for today. So again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, More Than Half, Brain Injury and Justice-Involved Youth. Today's webinar is indeed brought to you by the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania, the National Partnership for Juvenile Services, and the Pennsylvania Department of Health. My name is William Moore, and I'm with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. And as your technical host, I would like to discuss a few items or features of Adobe Connect with you all to keep in mind. Please note that today's webinar is indeed being recorded. The recording will be archived on our YouTube or NTTAC's YouTube channel. Here, you will also be able to see any and all past recordings. If you'd like to access the event transcript or any supporting materials, please contact the OJJDP NTTAC Help Desk. To download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Here, you will also find an FAQ for webinar participants that will likely address any technical related questions. Simply click on the file name and then click the download button. During today's webinar, presenters will address questions during our Q&A segment of the webinar. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to help us count. Please go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing today's webinar alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. And I'll give folks just a couple of seconds to do that. Please type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there's no need to type anything at this time. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye out for your email for the certificate. And please note that only participants that are registered and signed in will receive a certificate of attendance. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief evaluation about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. I will now turn today's webinar over to our moderator, Mr. Francis Mendez, Project Director of OJJDP's NTTAC.
Thank you, William. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the important topic of brain injury among juvenile justice-involved youth. We have 3 great presenters today that I'm going to introduce. First, we have Monica Vaccaro, who's the Director of Programs for the Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania. She provides oversight and direction to multiple programs, such as the Pennsylvania Juvenile Justice Initiative, the Brain Step School Reentry Program, an education training program, and the Brain Injury Resource Line. Ms. Vaccaro has 28 years of experience working with individuals with brain injury and their families as a clinician in medical rehabilitation. We also have MJ Smith, who's both a family member, someone with a brain injury, and a professional with more than 25 years of experience. Ms. Schmidt has worked in acute and post-acute brain injury rehabilitation as a researcher and a writer, and most recently in several grant-funded projects involving justice-involved youth populations in the state of Pennsylvania. We also have Wayne Bear with us. He's the CEO of the National Partnership for Juvenile Services and Executive Director of the Juvenile Detention Centers and Alternative Programs of Pennsylvania. Prior to that role, he was president of the National Juvenile Detention Association. He has a 27-year career working in detention as a frontline staff, juvenile probation officer, and in residential program management. So I will turn it over to our first presenter, Monica Vaccaro.
Thanks, Francis. This work is funded by a Traumatic Brain Injury State Implementation Partnership Grant from the Administration of Community Living, awarded to the Pennsylvania Department of Health. In this webinar, we'll review some definitions of brain injury, causes and prevalence. We'll talk about how to screen for brain injury. We'll discuss a position statement on best practices in brain injury and juvenile justice developed by the National Partnership for Juvenile Services. And we'll discuss some resources and implications for practice. So the learning objectives on this screen just mirror the what we will cover items that I mentioned. Looking at the most recent surveillance data on traumatic brain injury for the Centers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which were released this year, we know that nationwide there were 56,000 deaths from traumatic brain injury, 282,000 hospitalizations, and nearly double the number of emergency room visits as compared to what there were in 2013. And the increase in ED visits might be related to an increased awareness about TBI, and more people are seeking care. You know, awareness of health issues have been driven up by the media coverage that's increased so much related to sports-related concussions and state-level legislation that requires coaches to receive training about brain injury and managing concussions, and public education campaigns such as those by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention targeted to athletes, parents, coaches, and healthcare providers and educators. This graphic, again from the CDC surveillance data on traumatic brain injury, shows the causes of traumatic brain injury. And you can see that the leading cause of traumatic brain injury by far is falls at 47%, and this is definitely up from what we have seen in previous years. You can also see that 15% of brain injuries were caused by being struck or against something. These are often sports-related injuries. 14 from traffic accidents, which used to lead the way in years past, and 9% from assault. And keep that number in mind as we talk a little bit about what we found in the Justice Evolved use. So who's at most risk for brain injury? We know that ages 0 to 4 are at risk, primarily through falls and abusive head trauma. 15 to 19-year-olds, mostly from sports injuries. This is when kids start to drive. There's a lot of risk-taking behavior. And those over the age of 65, our fastest growing population of individuals with brain injury, primarily due to falls. And in every age group, traumatic brain injury rates are higher for males than females. And the group that have the highest rates of TBI-related emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and deaths combined are males aged 0 to 4. So taking a step back for a minute, when we're talking about brain injury, we're talking about acquired brain injury, and this is in the flow chart, this is the umbrella at the top of the flow chart. An acquired brain injury is something that has happened after the birth process and is not a degenerative process. So we're assuming a normally developing brain up until some point in time when something happens to cause damage to the brain. So acquired brain injury is the term for all brain injuries that occur after the birth process, and it's divided into two groups. On the left, you see non-traumatic, meaning it comes from an internal cause, something inside the body causes damage to the brain. And on the right, you see traumatic brain injury, which is an external physical force, where it can be divided into open head injury and closed head injury. So thinking about those non-traumatic brain injuries, things that come from an internal cause, brain tumors can cause brain injury. The space they take up, the tissues they impinge upon, and the surgery to remove them. Anoxia and hypoxia, insufficient oxygen or lack of oxygen to the brain. After a few minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, without oxygen, brain cells start to die. So in situations like cardiac arrest or near drowning, you can see people who have had an episode of anoxia or hypoxia, which causes brain injury. Infections of the brain, meningitis, encephalitis, cerebral vascular accidents, hemorrhaging, aneurysms. We often think of these as strokes. They cause damage to the brain. And ingestion of toxic substances, heavy metals, drug and alcohol abuse. And there is increasing awareness of the relationship between brain injury and opioid misuse. Knowing that with opioid misuse, there are periods of lack or insufficient oxygen to the brain which can cause brain injury. a non-fatal drug overdose, when someone has potentially been rescued, there's almost always a period of a lack of oxygen to the brain and brain injury occurs. But also there's a potential for addiction in the brain injury population. There's chronic pain associated with brain injury, and if opioids are prescribed, a person with brain injury is at risk. So traumatic brain injury, the other side of the flow chart, is an insult to the brain caused by an external physical force. Something outside of the body has caused an injury to the brain. Now, not all blows or jolts to the brain result in a traumatic brain injury. There's a wide severity of brain injury, mild, which could be just a brief change in mental status or consciousness. You don't have to lose consciousness to sustain a brain injury. It could be a change in mental status. Through to severe, where there's an extended period of unconsciousness, amnesia, probably neuroradiologic findings. So what's important here is to know that these definitions are medical definitions. We're talking about the level of severity of the injury at the time it occurred, not the functional level of the person as they are recovering over time. There can be a person with mild brain injury who has severe functional impairment, someone with a severe brain injury who may have less severe functional impairment than you might predict. So some brain injuries, some mild brain injuries, MJ will talk about concussion in a minute or two, you can have a full recovery in most cases, but most brain injuries result in long-term consequences. You know, the brain is very complex. It controls everything, our balance, our ability to walk and talk and eat. It coordinates and regulates our vital functions like breathing and heart rate. It's responsible for our ability to speak, to process, to remember, and to make decisions and to experience emotions. So there can be impairments in any of those areas. Every brain is unique and is extremely sensitive to the environment. So the effects of brain injury are unpredictable in their consequence. It affects the way a person thinks, acts, and feels, and it can change everything in a matter of seconds, but no two brain injuries are the same. The effects are complex and vary greatly from person to person. And an individual with brain injury can sometimes after that injury experience some mental health effects, most commonly anxiety and depression. And they can suffer also social and emotional difficulties over time and are at risk for other disorders such as epilepsy and degenerative dementia. We have some special concerns about children to talk about, especially given this topic of juvenile offenders, youth offenders. You know, we know that traumatic brain injury is the leading cause of death and disability in children, and yet, certainly in disability in children, and yet historically it's pretty underdiagnosed. You know, the highest rates of brain injury come from shaken baby syndrome, more frequently being called abusive head trauma, from falls, motor vehicle crashes, and sports and recreation injuries. And it was once thought that childhood was the best time to sustain a brain injury, as the young brain was believed to have plasticity, to be able to rewire and to compensate for function that's lost in the injury. However, research has revealed that it's really quite the opposite, that the young brain is in a constant state of growth and development, making early childhood an especially difficult time to sustain a traumatic brain injury. Ongoing maturation can easily be disrupted by the injury to the brain, and unlike adults, children don't have the knowledge or experience base upon which to develop some compensatory skills. Also, the brain of a child is undifferentiated, and as learning occurs, the areas of the brain become more specialized in what they do. So if a child is injured before the brain is differentiated, future development, including learning, will be affected negatively. This chart illustrates the development of the brain over time, with age indicated on the horizontal axis and increments in development on the vertical axis. So you'll see there are peaks of development over the course of this age span, which this graph shows age 1 to 21, and we're beginning to see and to learn that the frontal lobes of the brain are continuing to develop well past the age of 21. But you see the first peak is in early childhood. The greatest percent of brain maturation occurs in the early years from birth through age 5. Think about it. This is when we're learning to walk, to speak. We're bonding with people, forming relationships. despite the myth that injury during this time is of little consequences, we really know that during this tremendous stage of development, it could be devastating to have a brain injury. So if you look at the next piece, it looks like it comes in like around age 7, and this is when, you know, children are learning to read, to write, to follow directions. They're learning some impulse control. You see another peak at around age 12 where kids are becoming more coordinated. They're playing more team sports. You know, you see another one around age 15 where they're learning language, communicating socially, more peer-related social interactions, as well as with adults. And then the 5th one that you're seeing is around age 19. And this is when people start developing more responsibility, start planning their life. This is where the frontal lobe begins to develop more, and we're able to plan, to anticipate consequences of our actions. And as we said, this is developing well into our family and perhaps beyond. And so what about concussions? As we'll get to later, many of the brain injuries that are found among justice-involved populations would be classified as mild. Many are concussions. We know that most concussions, in fact, about 90% of concussions are going to heal fully, but there are groups of people for whom that's just not true. Their recovery might be prolonged or complicated or incomplete. Some individuals will experience lifelong lasting effects that will impact how they live their lives, how they work, how productive they are. Other people might have multiple concussions. We know that that also means that those effects could be long-lasting. So not only are most brain injuries in justice-involved populations classified as mild, most are also undiagnosed. Looking at this slide, it's easy to see why this might be. I'm guessing that many people who are in our audience today have worked with youth who have been classified as having been abused. How many of those kids actually had a brain injury diagnosed at some point? What about those who involved in repeated fights or sports or high-risk activities? To complicate matters further, we can't see brain injuries. Even people who sustain very severe brain injuries might not have any visible effects to the naked eye. And for that reason, it's called a hidden disability. And when it's undiagnosed, brain injuries can create problems that will impact the life trajectory. It can cause cognitive problems, including poor judgment, difficulty learning, impaired memory, behavioral personality problems, poor social skills. And as a result, a person who sustains a brain injury young might disengage academically, drop out of school, start misusing substances, have difficulty getting or keeping jobs, and ultimately, they might get into trouble with the law. And when problems emerge, they're interpreted by systems that don't have responsibility about brain injury. They're not looking for that as an underlying cause. Think about an adolescent who's getting into trouble. She might be getting treatment in a mental health system or through a substance abuse professional or even in a mandated justice program. But unless there's brain injury documented in the chart, no one is really thinking about that as a potential cause of the problems that they're seeing. Furthermore, the kinds of problems that can result from brain injury can be particularly problematic in justice settings. Failing to respond to directives quickly or not initiating a request for assistance could be interpreted as disrespect, a lack of cooperation, or even laziness. Not remembering prior discussions or having inconsistent attention and memory can impact, for example, the way a probation officer may interpret behavior. Is this kid being shady? Is he or she hiding something? And not having a good awareness of one's problems is very problematic in a system that expects people to recognize their shortcomings, insight, and accept treatment to help them. Youth with brain injury need a different approach for all of the reasons we see on this slide. The constellation of problems that includes executive dysfunction, emotional regulation, and problems with memory. Those problems aren't under their willful control. And the impact of their brain injury may not have been immediately evident at the time of injury, given the age-related demands. Think about somebody getting an injury in kindergarten, for example. At that time, they're not expected to do very much on their own. Mom and dad wake them up for school, take them to the bus, help them plan and prepare things. The teacher literally tells them when to stand up, when to sit down, when to open a book, close a book, and she tolerates a wide range of behaviors. Fast forward to 5th, 6th, 7th grade, and the impact of that injury might look very different. Child might not be able to carry out an assignment that lasts a couple of days. They might not recognize that mom is giving them the eye. That means they need to pipe down. And so it's really important to think about the age of the injury, no matter when you're seeing the problems emerge. So what do we know about brain injury and justice-involved populations from the research? You know, we've got an hour today, so we are going to skim through this so quickly. Hopefully you'll have some of the resources here on the slides if you want to look further. We know through meta-analysis that this happens a lot. 60% of inmates have a history of brain injury prior to their incarceration. We also know from longitudinal studies that criminal behavior tends to increase after brain injury, and that repeated injuries are particularly problematic and associated with increased offending behavior. Among youth, we know that the rate of brain injury is 3 to 8 times higher among juvenile offenders, with many of those children reporting histories of loss of consciousness and repeat injuries. On this slide, you'll see a picture of Rikers Island. There's a study done there in 2013 where they screened all of the kids who were coming in. And what they found was pretty astonishing. 67.4% reported history of at least one brain injury. There wasn't really a gender difference between those. And if we look at that number of assaults, 55%, more than 55%, was the cause by assault, very different than what we saw in the general population numbers. And so here, we're going to talk a little bit about the work that Monica and I have been involved with over the past several years. We're going to share some findings from projects that come to us from 2 youth detention centers and then some state-run Pennsylvania BJJS sites, as well as 1 county probation office. The goal of the project was to explore the issue of brain injury in juvenile justice settings in Pennsylvania and to attempt to implement a process for brain injury education and resource connections called NeuroResource Facilitation. The first element of our project was screening. Because many of the brain injuries in justice settings aren't diagnosed, we need to actively look for them. And this can't really be done just by saying, hey, have you ever had a head injury? Instead, it requires a regularly implemented screening process through structured interview to sketch out injury history, usually through possible causes. On the slide, you'll see listed several of the screening devices that are out there. The Traumatic Brain Injury Questionnaire designed for a corrections population, the HELPS, the Brain Injury Screening Questionnaire, which was the one used at Rikers Island, and the Ohio State University TBI Identification Form, which is the tool that we used in our work. Here's a photograph of the instrument. It was developed by John Corrigan and his colleagues at OSU. It is in your handout pod along with some instructions for clinicians. The OSU is a standardized procedure. It's short, it's interpretable, and the interpretation guidelines appear right on the instrument itself. And it's really useful in a lot of settings, including justice settings, domestic violence settings, aging settings. Screening positive for a history of events which could have caused a brain injury, however, is not the same as having impairment. And so in the work that we did, we had 3 doctoral neuropsychology students who were able to complete a short neurocognitive battery to determine whether or not the kids who had screened positive actually had impairments in their thinking that we would expect would impact their school, their work, their life. For any of you who are thinking about doing this work, this is the part of our project that's probably the hardest to replicate. Screening for brain injury is not that difficult and be done by a lot of different professionals. However, neurocognitive assessments can be more tricky. You can think about for your youth who have a documentable brain injury, seeking a neuropsychological evaluation through insurance. For other kids, or even for those children, you might ask a school district or vocational rehabilitation to think about doing an evaluation of memory and executive functioning. And certainly in juvenile justice, you have kids who are going out for all kinds of evaluations. No matter who kids are seeing, we should be letting them know if we think that they have a history of brain injury. The last phase of our project was entitled NeuroResource Facilitation. The goal of NRF is to understand brain injury and its impact and express that to kids and to their families, to identify and apply for the most relative programs and services to meet their needs, to problem solve any barriers that arise during that application process. And that means the NRF goes beyond information and referral. You're actually going to stay with and involved with a person until they're connected to the services that are going to make a difference for them. And on this slide, you'll see the kinds of resources that we connected kids to and that kids should be connected to if they have brain injuries. School programs, vocational rehabilitation programs, medical providers, whether it's therapies or specific doctors, support groups, and counseling. So we're going to present some findings from this project as MJ described it. But first we're going to look at data from a project that we did with adult male inmates in a maximum security prison in the Philadelphia area. This informed our work with juveniles. So you can see from this slide that we screened 164 inmates, and these were all men who were projected to be released into the community within 6 to 9 months. And so we wanted to be able to connect them with resources. So first we had to identify them. We screened them using the traumatic brain injury questionnaire, and we found that 76% of the men that we screened were positive for a history of events that could have caused a brain injury. But not just one brain injury. On average, individuals reported 4.1 events that could have caused a brain injury. And here's the finding that really surprised us, and that was that 75% of the events that were reported occurred before the age of 21, some in early childhood and adolescence. And this, made us think that the place to begin the intervention is younger, when kids are perhaps in the juvenile system. If we could find them, connect them with resources that could support them in their brain injury, and perhaps also the trajectory of their lives, with the hope that they might not end up in the adult correctional system. And as MJ said, another element of the program was doing neurocognitive testing, and this was done by interns under the supervision of a clinical neuropsychologist, Dr. Drew Nagel. And so we found that 72% of the individuals that we screened also had cognitive impairment. So looking at our juvenile data, we screened in 2 detention centers. Those are the data that we're going to limit our presentation to today. We screened a large number, 485 youth, and 48.5, nearly half of them, screened positive for an event that could have caused a brain injury. Again, with the youth, on average, it wasn't 1 injury, it was 3 events that were reported. And then neurocognitive testing was administered to these youth, and 57% showed evidence of impairment. We're not talking about mild impairments. We set the bar very carefully. So we're looking at impairments that are severe as compared to their age-related peers. So if you take this all together, that means that we might expect that 28% of the kids who entered detention, and detention is only one point of entry into the system, obviously, but 28% of those youth have some level of impairment related to brain injury that we would expect to impact their ability to be successful in the community, success in school, success in managing their lives at home and their relationships, and for many, success in the workplace. A few other just interesting points. You know, the population that we worked with were 79% male, 21% female, which is right in line with the juvenile justice statistics for gender. The age of the youth that we screened ranged from 12 to 20 years old with a median age of 16, and the grade level in parallel ranged from 6th grade to 12th grade with a median grade of 10th grade. So looking at the time of injury, at what age were these youth injured? This shows the relative frequency of events over various age spans. And you can see that the highest bar in this chart indicates that the greatest number of events were reported to have occurred between the ages of 10 to 14, followed by the age span of 15 to 20, but that there were many events reported to have occurred at younger ages as well. As we discussed, on average, youth reported, I think it was 3 events per youth, but 70% of the youth reported having 1 event, but 27% reported having 2 events or more that could have caused a brain injury. We use the OSU screening tool, TBI identification method in this project, and one of the features of that tool asks the person being screened whether there was ever a period of time when they experienced multiple impacts to the head, such as a history of abuse or contact sports, something that could have exposed them to repeated injuries from a specific cause that are essentially uncountable because individual episodes wouldn't be recalled. And these are a special category of injury. And 40% of the youth who screened positive for a history of exposure to brain injury on the OSU TBI ID had repetitive brain injury, repetitive injury to the head. And of course, of those reporting repetitive brain injury, as you would expect, 56% were from sports, 24% were from abuse, 14% were from fights, 2% from domestic violence, and 4% from miscellaneous causes. So violence occurs in a lot of these cases, whether it was abuse, fights, or domestic violence. There were a lot of repetitive injuries to the head caused by violence, and this is in stark contrast, as MJ said, to the surveillance data that shows in the population that is not justice involved specifically, assault occurred for 9%. Another interesting finding suggests a natural point where intervention might be helpful, where we might bring our resources to bear, and that is that 52% of the youth in our sample already had special education in place. They had individualized educational plans, probably not informed by the possibility that these youth had brain injury. So this is a chance for us to come in, to look at the IEP, to suggest some strategies and interventions to support the student from the perspective of the brain injury. So now we'll just take a little bit of time to talk about the resources that you might consider for kids that you know have a brain injury. The first area to think about are school support. Traumatic brain injury was added as a special education eligibility category under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, more than 25 years ago. This allows individuals that you serve to gain access to special education or other services through accommodations or a 504 plan. Some states have specific brain injury school reentry teams. Here in Pennsylvania, we have Brain Steps reentry teams throughout the state that are mediated through our intermediate units. This is also done in Colorado. In Oregon, there are special TBI teams, as there's Project Brain in Tennessee. My suggestion would be, if you have a kid and you're thinking about this, to check with your state brain injury association or alliance for their suggestions. Vocational rehabilitation is available in all states and can help individuals with any kind of disability to reach their employment-related goals. Until recently, Voc Rehab was focused only on adults. However, with the adoption of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Voc Rehab is now mandated to assist individuals with disabilities between the ages of 14 and 21. Voc Rehab agencies in all states offer early reach services, which can include things like job shadowing, work-based learning experiences, where kids will actually try on a job with the help of a coach over a period of time and get paid. Vocational interest and aptitude testing is available through Voc Rehab, as is assistance with career planning. Other resources that kids with brain injury may need are medical in nature, especially for individuals who have newer injuries or unresolved symptoms after concussion. They may benefit from a consultation with a physical medicine and rehabilitation doctor or team. They may need physical therapy, occupational therapy, vestibular therapy, vision therapy, and those things can really make a difference. We also know that depression and anxiety can follow brain injury, and so it's important for us to be watching for that and reporting that to any supportive counselors who are involved with kids, making sure that everyone knows that brain injury and potential cognitive impairment are a variable that should be considered in their treatment. There are also state brain injury associations and alliances throughout the United States, and you certainly can look them up through the internet. They can help you find support groups or make resource connections. And finally, there's a very important number on the screen here, this 1-800 number, which is a national resource line. It's not a crisis line, but it's a great place to call if you have questions about where you might find support or how to problem solve something for an individual with brain injury. This slide just shows you some information resources, places to go for good information about brain injury, whether it's for yourself or to share with an individual or a family. First one is BrainLine. Second one is the CDC, which always has great stuff, the Brain Injury Association of America. And then this last one, the MSKTC link, is a terrific one that I recommend you take a peek at. These are fact sheets on a lot of different topics within brain injury recovery, cognitive issues after brain injury and sexuality, brain injury and driving, on and on. And they're available both in English and in Spanish, and they are brought to us by the Model Systems program.
So most juvenile justice jurisdictions across the nation are introducing approaches focused on applying individualized evidence-based interventions to youth based on their identified risks, needs, and responsivity factors. While there appear to be significant and growing research on risk and needs, specifically focused on recidivism, the availability of data to guide discussions on responsivity factors are still in the early stages of development. Based on the Department of Health funded project in Pennsylvania, the national partnership decided there was an opportunity to inform the field and develop guidance specific to brain injury, as it has become clear that this population is under-identified. In September 2018, with the input of the national partnership membership and guidance from the Brain Injury Association, NPJS developed a position statement. A link is available later in the presentation. Certainly, staff need to be aware of the potential and the risks associated with engaging youth with brain impairment. It's important that the staff are trained to be able to assess and use tools that are validated and be able to make some referrals to folks who have expertise in providing those resources, both within the organization, and be able to make those connections with community organizations when those youth return home and are no longer under the jurisdiction of the juvenile justice system. National Partnership has taken a fairly significant step in putting together the resources or putting together some information to have this conversation and get this conversation started and be able to look at ways in which we can support folks to identify ways to assess youth locally, connect kids and families with the resources necessary to help them move positively in a direction that's going to benefit them in the long term.
Great, thank you, Wayne. So now we're going to go into the question and answer session. So we have some questions already that have been submitted. Please post your questions in the chat box. So the first question is, what is the difference to identify TBI and developmental trauma which has similar social cognitive difficulties? Monica, did you want to tackle that?
Sure. So I wanted just to clarify that this question is referring to emotional trauma as compared to brain trauma. Am I interpreting that question correctly? If so, I would say that I read some of the literature on trauma-informed care. I know MJ and I have heard about it at conferences as well, and I've seen some of the literature that shows brain changes associated with emotional trauma. We're talking about physical trauma, which is different, but I'm sure the two interact, and it would be important to collaborate on those. They are different for sure, where brain injury is physical trauma to an organ of the brain that causes damage, where this emotional trauma is a different type of trauma that can also cause some brain changes. Absolutely. The thing that I would add there is that knowing if a person has a brain injury in the way that we're discussing here may impact the kinds of treatments that they're able to use if they're working on trauma that's emotional. So they might not be able to remember from session to session, for example, or they might not process quickly enough to be effective in a group treatment. And so I think it's just important to understand both of them for all of the treaters involved so that the treatment plan for that kid considers what they're able to do and what they're not so able to do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And we had another question, whether fetal alcohol spectrum disorder should be included in the screening causes for brain injury.
So, I mean, when our area of expertise is an acquired brain injury, meaning that it's something that happens to the brain after the birth process, not a developmental disability. So absolutely, fetal alcohol syndrome could be associated with cognitive impairments, and we could generalize this to cognitive impairment. But our work is specifically with brain injury after the birth process that has happened from either a traumatic cause, something outside of the body, or a non-traumatic cause. Right, and all of the screening instruments that we present at VOSU, we talked about very specifically, but the brain injury screening questionnaire, the HELP, the TBI-2 that we used in our Graterford work, all of them focus on acquired brain injury or traumatic brain injury, so they're all about problems that emerged after the birth process. So they're not included there either, and the instruments are validated for the causes that they reflect.
Great. So I'm going to read a question for Wayne. The question is, will there be more training on traumatic brain injury from the practitioner lens at the National Partnership Juvenile Services Conference in Salt Lake City in October?
We're just in the process of putting together our call for presenters, and certainly we'll be reaching out to the Brain Injury Association for some as a presenter for that session.
Great.
We'd be glad to be involved.
Wonderful. So we have a question about definition. So how is interpersonal violence different from abuse or fights?
You know, from the perspective of the impact on the brain, it's not different at all. I think that some of the instruments we use and some of the way we collect data just allows us to separate out the source of the violence, but the actual impact on the brain is not different. Right.
Great. So we also had a question about the research, right? So, you know, doctors, the question is referencing that doctors have stated that children who are injured at a young age are able to better compensate for that type of injury. When has the research changed to show this is not true?
No, I can't say that I can point to a period in time, and we can certainly look for some references for you on that. But certainly from a development standpoint, the data are pretty clear that, you know, the brain is impacted, arrested in some ways at the point of injury, and the brain is not normally learning after that. So, you know, I just think it's a shift in thinking that has come over time. I can't put a date on it, but we can look for some resources some research if that would be helpful. We've had a lot of experience in working with kids too, so we see this in clinical practice.
Great. So there's a question about, since brain injury is cognitive and emotional, if undiagnosed, is it more specific to show up in adults than in children?
So this kind of gets, if I'm interpreting the question correctly, this kind of gets back to the idea of, you know, children and having a brain injury in childhood, having some special things to consider because of the development. So what we see a lot in kids is that early on, if they have an injury, say when they're 5 and they're in kindergarten, they may really look as if they're doing okay. Because when you're in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, your teachers and your parents are essentially managing all the higher level functions. They're managing your organization, keeping track of your papers, helping you to study, the functions of the frontal lobe of the brain. You know, teachers and parents are doing that for really young kids because those parts of the brain aren't developing until later in life. But as kids start to get into middle school, high school, and certainly adulthood, where the demands on them are different, and where the expectation of emotional function and executive function are higher, you start to see the brain injury manifest. It's not new. They haven't gotten worse in some way. It's just that the effects are seen later in life when the demands are different and might not be seen in childhood. The brain injury doesn't change, but the demands on the brain change.
Okay, thank you. So this question is for Wayne. Is it appropriate to incarcerate juveniles with a traumatic brain injury for their aggressive behavior along with juvenile offenders?
Well, that's a good question, a kind of a tough question. I think that what you will find is that there are programs where staff are specifically trained to be able to respond to aggressive behavior. That may look, the approach and the responses may look a little different than programs that are dealing with kids who have less aggressive behavior. So it's a question of being able to, or the ability to be able to match those skills, those behavioral response skills with therapeutic interventions that are specifically identified or aligned with the risks, needs, and responsivity factors of those individual youth. I hope that answers the question.
So I had a question I'll open up to any of the presenters. The question is, do you all look at racial disparities in this process?
We have not looked at that. We certainly could. You know, our project was a demonstration project, and it wasn't really a research project, but we're starting to look at it more from the research angle, and that certainly is something we could examine. I mean, the popular literature suggests that there are racial disparities in the correction system in general in terms of incarceration. Yeah, and there's racial disparities and insurance disparities across all age groups in brain injury rehabilitation. So I would imagine that we would find something. It's tricky in our project because the geographies were identified for us, and they're not necessarily representative of, the racial diversity across the state of Pennsylvania. And as we move this work more toward the idea of answering research questions, I think that's an important one to look at. We would need a larger sample across a more widespread geographic area to do that.
Thank you. So we have a question about the participant has noticed that several of their court-involved youth suffer from epilepsy or brain seizure disorders, and they also have trauma from child abuse. So is there any research that links the two, specific research that you could refer our audience members to?
Linking abuse
Trauma
with
from child
epilepsy.
abuse? Yeah, trauma from child abuse with court-involved youth that suffer from epilepsy or brain seizure disorders.
Well, certainly brain injury in general. One of the common comorbidities with brain injury is epilepsy. I don't know that it's specific to brain injury caused by violence. Epilepsy is a vulnerability for anyone who's had a brain injury, and it can happen at any time. Frequently, you see it immediately after the injury, but sometimes you see it later on during the recovery phase. It's mostly prevalent in brain injuries where there has been an open head injury where the skull has been impacted. That tends to be more commonly associated with epilepsy, but it can happen for anyone with a brain injury.
Thank you. This question is for Wayne. Do you recommend a screening of all justice-involved youth in detention for a traumatic brain injury?
So this is another interesting question, challenging question. I certainly recommend that all youth are screened. The question, the issue that's arisen in Pennsylvania specifically in certain jurisdictions is how that information may or may not be used in the determination of culpability. So as any organization begins to explore this, I think that local jurisdiction or the statewide needs to explore the implications from a legal process around how attorneys, how courts want or may, at what point will that information be shared and used in determining either culpability or how it may be used in determining outcomes in terms of like a disposition or recommendations for services. So it's a timing issue, it's a complicated issue, and I think that how those things are defined from state to state may be slightly different.
I just want to jump in here. This is MJ. Just to say that there's another component to it that I would add, and that's that we know that kids might screen positive for an event that could have caused a brain injury, but there's that second element of our project that's very hard to kind of figure out where to place and who's going to pay for within Juvenile Justice Services, and that's the neurocognitive assessment. Not all kids who have had potential brain injuries are going to have cognitive impact. I think in our research we came, it's about half, a little better than half. And so it's not something that you can say a screening is just going to put kids in a bucket that says they've had a brain injury with cognitive impairment. We have to think about how we figure that out as the next step and who's going to pay for it and how it's going to occur. And just to let you know what our current focus is, again, through a grant provided to the Pennsylvania Department of Health by the Administration on Community Living, we're now working with a variety of justice services providers in the juvenile system to provide technical assistance to apply elements of our project in their setting. In some cases it's screening, could be neurocognitive testing, connections to resources, and obviously there's a big education component. So while we aren't directly collecting data, we're not directly screening kids anymore, we're providing assistance to other providers to be able to apply this in their setting.
Thank you. So this question is for Monica and MJ. Since we know that some of these young people are undiagnosed, what signs or symptoms for folks who aren't practitioners in this area should they look for to determine if screening is necessary?
Well, screening by definition isn't something that you select. And you don't select people to screen. You screen. A screening protocol means that you screen everyone, and then you find out who has this potential history. So, I mean, you might look at some kids and get a sense that there's a brain injury, but that's not really the criteria for screening.
Okay, great. So thank you to Wayne, MJ, and Monica. This concludes the end of our question and answer session. Now I'm going to turn it over to William.
Great. Thank you very much, Francis. And thank you again to our presenters, again, Wayne, MJ, and Monica for the wonderful presentation today. And thank you for Brain Injury Association of Pennsylvania, the National Partnership for Juvenile Services, and the Pennsylvania Department of Health for bringing this great webinar and this great content to light. That being said, I just have a few last-minute announcements for everyone to keep in mind. Please note that if you want to contact NTTAC, you may do so through our website displayed on this slide. You can stay up to date on the latest information by signing up for our TTA listserv, and also don't forget to check us out on Facebook at OJJDP NTTA. And you can also contact OJJDP via the Help Desk by following this information on this slide. And do you have a training and technical assistance need? Well, if you do, please submit a request via the OJJDP TTA 360 platform. You may do so through the link displayed on this slide. As a reminder, the webinar will be recorded and archived on NTTAC's YouTube channel, where you can also view past webinars. And for the event transcript and supporting materials, please be sure to contact the OJJDP TTA Help Desk. Please take a moment to review the disclaimer on this slide. And lastly, we would appreciate if you take about 5 minutes to complete the feedback evaluation. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
The host has left